Good evening and welcome to the panel Humanity First Agenda for the Digital Age. My name is Ivana Jurko. I'm leading the Evidence and Influence team at Humanitech, and I will be your moderator tonight. I would like to start by acknowledging the Wathaurong people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm speaking to you from today. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which you are all joining us tonight. As we share our knowledge and learning, may we all pay respects to the ancestors of all First Nations peoples, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge their stories, traditions, and living cultures, as it is their knowledge and experiences that hold the key to success of future generations. Now, fast-moving shifts in technology are shaping the world we live in with significant impact on people's lives and livelihoods, bringing new opportunities, but also creating new vulnerabilities. It is within this context that Australian Red Cross established Humanitech, a think and do tank which seeks to harness the power of technology for good by putting humanity at its center. Through Humanitech, we want to ensure that the opportunities afforded to us all by data and technology serve many, not just a few, and that the risks of misuse and malfunction are addressed. This is particularly critical in the context of crisis and disadvantage. At Humanitech, we collaborate with partners across sectors to develop unique insights into the social implications of frontier technologies, to create and amplify products or solutions with the greatest potential for social impact and influence so that technology serves humanity by putting people at the center. Now, tonight, you'll hear about some of our work, including the Trust Alliance, which is a multi-stakeholder collaboration working to establish a useful and ethical digital identity ecosystem, and an early initiative that came out of Humanitech, and our partnership with the new or recent Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our excellent panel of speakers tonight. Joining us tonight, we have Professor Heather Horst, Director of the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University, and the Chief Investigator in the Centre of Excellence. She's a socio-cultural anthropologist by training, and she's focusing on bringing a majority world perspectives into the work of the Centre. Also with us is Libby Young, a collaborative researcher and strategist who is focused on power, governance, and equity of data and technology. Libby works with groups like the Open Data Institute, Open Ownership, and the Sydney Policy Lab, as well as Humanitech, and she's also a PhD candidate in the Centre of Excellence. Last but certainly not least, and possibly a very familiar face to many in our audience, Katie Saltoll leads a growing multi-sector collaboration that brings together private, public, and for-purpose stakeholders to develop and use shared standards and design principles for good digital identity. Prior to this, Katie was head of international programs in Australian Red Cross. And before that, she had a long career as a consultant and a leader in organizations such as Oxfam, Save the Children, and other INGOs. Now, just before we kick into the main part of this session, I just wanted to acknowledge perhaps an inherent contradiction of bringing to you an all-Australian panel to a conference that is asking the question, who are the humanitarians? Now, in another setting, at another conference, having an all-female panel talking about data and technology would perhaps be extraordinary. But in this context, however, it is important to both reflect and acknowledge that Humanitech, Trust Alliance, and the Centre of Excellence, while early in our journeys, are driven to enable pathways for affected communities and grassroots leaders to have their voices at the center of research, design, and governance of technology. As you'll hear tonight, this is central to what we are talking about when we advocate for humanity-first approaches to data and technology. Now, in terms of content that we'll talk about tonight, you'll hear about a report we published earlier this year on future vulnerability, humanity in the digital age. Humanitech wanted to explore how frontier technologies are shaping the future of vulnerability, and our research became even more relevant as the pandemic accelerated the shift in our personal and professional lives further into the digital realm, And we saw the implications of our technology choices occur in real time as states introduced different tools to track and trace COVID, and as they started debating and exploring vaccine passports. The research uncovered a range of insights and questions that humanitarians especially need to ask if we want to ensure responsible, ethical, and inclusive use and governance of these technologies. In the report, we focus on examples of harm, but we also uncover examples of good practice, and we highlight an agenda for change across research, policy, and practice towards humanity-first approaches. And Center of Excellence and the Trust Alliance are very firmly and very much a part of that agenda. So tonight you'll hear about the highlights and the key insights from the report. You'll also hear about how the Center of Excellence is investigating the social implications of automation in different contexts, and how the Trust Alliance is putting humanity-first approaches to technology into practice. Before I ask our panel to tell us about their work and how it connects to this central theme of humanity first, just a quick reminder that there is a space on the Delegate Connect platform for you to post comments or questions. Now, I have to acknowledge that due to the shortness of this session, at only 45 minutes, we may not get to your questions. However, we are keen to continue the conversation, so do please post them on there, because we can get back to them later on Delegate Connect, but also through email, as I will be posting links to our websites and the Future Vulnerability Report onto the platform following tonight's session. So without further ado, I will stop sharing the screen. And I will invite Livy, who was the lead author of our Future Vulnerability Report, to give us some of her reflections and a bit of a sense of what are some of the key insights from the report that point us to what humanity-first approaches to data and technology should look like.
Thank you, Ivana. And hello, everyone. I wish there were hellos in person, but it's good that we can still be doing things in this way. And I hope you are having a good conference. It's certainly an incredible program. I will be as brief as I can be. This topic is, I think, this conference in general, they're not things which being brief on comes naturally around. And I think that's part of the point of how actually technology is not working in this space. But I will try and be as fast as I can. And Ivana, please step in when I have stopped being fast. So as Ivana said, the report looked at the intersection of communities at risk, affected communities, or people in contexts of vulnerability, humanitarianism, and technology. And with everything going on in technology at the moment, it makes it an even more complex space, I think, than it is ordinarily. I'll highlight 3 findings that came out in the research we did together, and I should say that Ivana was very much a close working partner in that process. First of all, why there's an urgency to act. I think sometimes we can assume we know what the problems are, and that's actually still part of the hard work that needs to be done. What's urgent, what's wrong, what needs to change. What sort of agenda for change is emerging, and there is an agenda for change emerging. And then what, I think most importantly, from the perspective of Humanitech, and I think from what this conference is looking at in terms of a shift from rhetoric to action, what are people already doing? Where is there evidence of positive change? And there is evidence of positive change. So to look at some of the case studies we drew out. Firstly, why there is an urgency. And I think there's an urgency in both ways, in the sense of ending harms that are being done, in some catastrophic harms, and also ending wasted opportunity that some of these new technologies are throwing up as new potentials. So just to start on the opportunity side, it's to give pause and think that I think it's 1 in 7 people globally don't have formal identification. 1 in 3 people globally don't have access to a bank account, and that has numerous significant repercussions for people in terms of accessing rights or services, etc. Technology has a role to play in helping to address these things. And indeed, the Identity Project, the Trust Alliance, which Ivana mentioned and Katie will talk about more, is an example of how these how technology can begin to address some of these challenges. At the same time, it is clear that new technologies, frontier technologies, however we describe them, and we don't focus overly on specific technologies because that gets you caught in a game of trying to keep up with the latest, technology spin or hype, is both increasing existing risks for communities and creating new ones. So, some of you may be familiar with the issue of algorithmic bias, which is essentially a new way of discriminating, which is automating decisions, removing human judgment, and predicting what's going to happen in the future to people, or what people are going to do in the future. Just describing it like that, it's deeply inhumane. And there's a lot of research demonstrating how this is doing things like stopping people's, particular communities' ability to access a medical appointment, right through to, being perceived as guilty in a future sense when it's not even about you specifically. And that's being used in context of criminal justice or policing. It's so extreme and strange that it's hard to get almost to conceive what is going on. But this is what some of automated decision making and algorithms and prediction is doing. At the same time, humanitarianism is being changed by technology in some very positive ways. It's helping to make some work much more efficient, but also in some, ways that raise serious questions. For instance, in Australia, 90% of not-for-profits rely on commercial technologies for, analysing and storing data. That raises all kinds of questions over the long term. Increasingly, there's a lot more data collection, which is giving rise to problems of what some academics have characterized as, humanitarian surveillance. And these are all enormous questions and things that are happening now. And I think a lot of that is seeing an increasing adoption of commercially run technologies with their own culture being used in humanitarian contexts, and that putting at risk humanitarian principles and humanitarian values. So when you hear something like human-centered design, which is a Silicon Valley or technology mantra, which sounds, human, that often in practice means testing with users to achieve operational efficiency and, market scalability, which is anathema to how to address, issues and the needs of people in communities at risk. So there is an urgency to do things, to change. There is an agenda emerging for change, and it's across spaces, advocacy, policy, academia, the open movement, and it's an agenda that is mindful of both risks and opportunities. And it's not just within humanitarianism, obviously. Many of you may have seen in the last week the EU's draft regulation for artificial intelligence, antitrust lawsuits in the US. Most of us are familiar with Cambridge Analytica, for instance. So this is across issues across society. The agenda for change is emerging in multi-stakeholder ways, in ways that really target both thinking and doing, being theoretical and applied at once. Multi-stakeholder groups, it's wonderful Heather is here because the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society is an excellent example of this. So Heather, it will be great to hear more from Heather. And in terms of thinking and doing and action, from rhetoric to action, Humanitech itself is an example of this. There are many others, just to reference a few more in Australia, as that's where I am sitting. In Canberra at ANU, there is a new school of cybernetics, which is developing a new branch of engineering effectively to keep humanity in technology. as it describes it. So there are things being done and people doing work. Specifically in humanitarianism, there's some concepts of things like, developing humanitarian logistics, thinking about how technology is primarily driven by business logistics currently. And there's Robin Mays, who is a researcher in humanitarian systems at University of Washington, who talks about this concept of humanitarian logistics and technology and needing to develop that. And then also, ideas of how to conceive of how technology can help differently in humanitarian situations and how it can help communities at risk differently. Julio Coppi, who's a digital specialist at the Norwegian Refugee Council, says, what about if we start by assuming the purpose of technology is simply to free up the time of people to do the work directly with each other that is needed. So it is not to become more part of the process. It is in fact to get out of the way as much as possible and create more time for people to interact. And I think a really powerful concept that's relevant for the agenda to be more locally driven and to have as much decision making at the local level as possible is the idea of community as headquarters, which Robin Mays beautifully expressed, and we tried to capture in the report. I'm trying to push along, Ivana. I'm sorry, I know I'm being too long. So briefly looking at some of the case studies we have in the report, trying to evidence what is changing and positively. And if you do plan to read the report and you are limited on time, as all of us are, I think, if you just have a chance to look at the case studies, hopefully that will give some food for thought of some sort, or resonate with something you're doing and, spark a conversation or a thought. And there are recurring insights across the case studies that we've tried to pull out that are, affected communities and civil society together need to be at the center of developing technologies, of testing new technologies. And this isn't currently happening. This needs to be the new business as usual. I set a tyrant, I know I'm at 10 minutes. And civil society-led initiatives can think of themselves, I think, as translators. So much of this work, if we're thinking of multi-stakeholder work, of work that is across different spaces, whether it's disciplines or sectors, business sectors, cultures, countries, the role of translation is incredibly important. I'll just end with one example, which is the Red Cross initiative, Trace the Face, which I'm sure you're familiar with, the issues around facial recognition. It has been banned in some cities. The EU is looking to, severely limit its use in its new proposed regulation. The error rates with facial recognition are catastrophically high for certain communities. Trace the Face is looking at how to develop facial recognition in a different way, to change the technology in order to use it for a need that people have, which is to reunite people with missing loved ones. Obviously, people will know much better than I, who are listening, what complex work that is and what knowledge people have developed of how to approach it over the period that humanitarians have been doing this incredibly complex work. But Trace the Face is an example of how a technology can be developed differently and do things that communities at risk need done, and humanitarians can use without eroding humanitarian values. So I'm going to end there. I'm sorry I've been so rushed, and look forward to hearing from Heather and Katie.
Thank you so much, Libby, and what an excellent job of trying to synthesize the findings that we actually captured in the report. For those of you who are intending to read the report, it's not overly long. I think we managed to keep it under 30 pages, but we certainly packed a lot of really insightful information in there, particularly for people who are working as practitioners in the context of vulnerability or crisis or with marginalized groups. So I do encourage you to check out our website and download the report. And thanks again, Libby, for emphasizing, I guess, the urgency to act, to investigate, to explore, to work across sectors and disciplines, because that's really what we're talking about when we talk about the new business as usual. well, and also about this multiness, initiatives that emphasize multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder approaches, different perspectives, different backgrounds. And I think that's something that definitely applies and resonates with the work of the Center of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society. Started its life in the middle of pandemic. It's a 7-year journey, and it is a collaboration of Australian and international academic and industry partners. And as I mentioned before, Humanitech and Australian Red Cross are very proud to be part of that journey. So I'd like to invite Heather to give us a little bit of an introduction of what the Center of Excellence aims to achieve and why this matters for humanitarian and international development practitioners. Over to you, Heather.
First of all, thank you very much. It was great to hear about the report directly from you, Libby, and I'm delighted that you're going to be part of the Center of Excellence alongside Ivana, who we've been getting to know for the past few years. So it's really wonderful to be able to kind of bring this together today. So in the interest of time, I will just sort of launch into a bit of a summary about the Center of Excellence. And I think, our basic premise at the beginning of this project is really that, what we understood as automation is really no longer just that. It is no longer about robots and making things and replacing people. It also involves computers actually making decisions and making judgments, as I think Libby mentioned in her discussion. So in general, we rely on computers to process data, make predictions, apply rules, choose actions, determine outcomes. And our center is really concerned about the consequences of these computer or automated decision-making processes. And we're in particular really interested in the ways in which humans now relate to machines and data, as well as how people who use the technologies and the institutions that govern them are and will need to actually change. So an important part of this work, and I think one that is a real departure from a range of other, I think we've had a number of new sort of centers and degrees and focusing on AI and other sorts of things, but we really wanted to be agnostic in some ways about the actual technology. So it's not just about AI, it's not just about robotics, blockchains, and other kinds of machines, but we're really interested in the processes that underpin the use of these technologies. And in the 7 years of the center, we actually anticipate that what we see now is actually going to change pretty substantively. And so we really wanted to kind of have a unit of study that was going to persist over this time rather than, following the kind of latest trend or the latest technologies. And in fact, the broader mission of the center is really to research, but also to intervene in and shape the ways that automated decision-making technologies are becoming integrated into our lives. So this means collaborating with people across different disciplines. So for example, I'm an anthropologist. In the course of this project, I'll perhaps work with computer and data scientists who are involved in the project. We have legal scholars. We also have critical communication scholars and a range of others who work in different sub-disciplines. And we're all kind of coming together to try to understand the implications of automated decision-making in society. But it also means quite fundamentally working with organizations like the Red Cross, but also with corporate and other kinds of industry and the government to develop policies, tools, as well as other platforms that will help to build a more responsible, a more ethical and inclusive form of automated decision-making. So the particular area that I want to actually kind of talk a little bit about today is the one that, as an anthropologist, seems obvious. I'm really interested in understanding how people make, operate, and reinvent automated decision-making tools and processes. And I'm particularly interested in this in what Ivana was calling kind of majority contexts that really have been largely ignored in the dominant literature on forms of automated decision-making. So a bulk of the research on automated decision-making is happening in Northern Europe, North America, other parts of the world, but less in some of the countries that I'll be talking a bit about today. The team that I'm working quite closely with is something called the People Program, and the Center of Excellence includes people like Sarah Pink, who's at Monash University in Australia, Deborah Lepton, who's at UNSW, and a range of others who are really interested in how automated decision-making is being integrated into the lives of diverse and non-dominant communities across Australia. So to discuss, just to kind of give you a sense of the kind of issues that we are and are going to continue to grapple with, because as Ivana said, we're really in the first year of the center. I want to focus on 3 examples that have come out of the review and mapping project that I've been working on with my colleague, Dr. Jalina Sinanan. So the first example comes from India, which has been in the news quite a bit lately. But in India, there have been a sort of spate of new payments and financial services that have emerged. So companies like Paytm and Google Pay are kind of exemplars in this space. And this has become, these kind of payment services and new financial services are really important in contexts where there are a large number of people who are unbanked and thus use these mobile payment systems to navigate their day-to-day lives. It's also, I think, notable that the use of digital payments in India have really increased with even the very first wave of COVID-19. So the proliferation of financial tools and payment platforms has led to the emergence of new credit scoring systems that use things like artificial intelligence and alternative data sources. So these can range from things like mobile contacts, GPS data, and browsing histories to really determine if someone is, kind of worthy of credit. They offer loans and manage collections for applicants, often without formal credit histories. And so there's obviously really some exciting new opportunities for those who live and exist outside formal systems of financial services. But you can also see quite clearly the potential for abuse. Lack of regulations could lead to an increase in indebtedness among populations who are targeted as potential users of these new ADM systems. And companies, consumers, and government regulators are all implicated as India's social service infrastructures as part of this, who will be forced to really contend with the consequences of misuse. So these are some of the issues that are coming up in our review, and you can sort of see, where the intersection of kind of humanitarian interests in dealing with inequality, the unbanked populations, marginalized communities, et cetera, really kind of come to the fore. You really start to see the consequences of these in people's lives. A second and very different kind of example actually comes from a focus on transport and mobility, which is one of the kind of focus areas of our center. And in particular, it's a project that looks at aerial, marine, and terrestrial robotics in the Pacific region. So some of you might have heard of something called South Pacific Flying Labs Network, which in the Pacific region has carried out pre- and post-disaster mapping of communities, as well as looking at things like agricultural trends, et cetera. And they've used these kind of maps that they've developed through sending out drones through the landscapes in different Pacific countries to assist, for example, with last mile humanitarian and medical deliveries after cyclones in the region. And this particular network is part of the We Robotics Network. So some of you may be familiar with Patrick Meyer, who set up crisis mapping, Ushahidi, and is now the CEO of We Robotics. So one of the aspects of this project that I think is particularly exciting is the fact that the NGO, or We Robotics and the flying sort of thing, builds local innovation labs where in-country organizations and individuals are then trained to use, operate, and build these robotics technologies. So in other words, alongside collecting new forms of data in regions of the world that are often framed as marginal to ADM and automation, this is an intervention into who can design, what can be designed, and for what purpose. And so this is just one example of the types of organizations involved in introducing and integrating ADM into new regions. And I should also just mention here that there are other colleagues in the center, such as Anthony McCosker at Swinburne, who's really exploring things like humanitarian data mapping much more explicitly. So this is, again, something that's coming up in our literature review, but really makes us think quite differently about what ADM and what it is and what it means in different sort of regions. And finally, I just wanted to mention an example a bit closer to home in Sydney. And it's actually, it's the work of one of our new PhD students, Rakesh Kumar, who's actually studying a non-dominant population in Australia. So Rakesh's project focuses on digital entrepreneurial work in home food and wellness industries among Indian migrants in Western Sydney. So these industries continue to expand and leverage a range of existing media and emergent platforms. So things ranging from YouTube, Shopify, Patreon, Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, etc. And Rakesh is really exploring the ways in which these digital platforms may actually remove some of the barriers and gatekeepers for entrepreneurs, especially migrant entrepreneurs. But Rakesh is also very attuned to the potential limitations. For example, Indian migrants in Australia often have very low social capital compared to the immense economic and political power wielded by these platforms, just as one example. Credit loans, for example, may be denied to migrant-run businesses based on postcodes, surnames, and credit histories that use predictive analytics of algorithms in Australia. And of course, advertising and marketing, their sort of little entrepreneurial, their startups, businesses, et cetera, may also be implicated through algorithms that kind of hold similar biases about region, codes, words, et cetera. So we hope that the findings of Rakesh's study, which again is, very new, he's just at the beginning of field work, the next few months, can be brought together with work by people like Paul Henman in our center, who's at the University of Queensland, who's looking at the use of automated decision-making in social services in Australia, as well as work being carried out at RMIT with Telstra and with Indigenous communities across Australia. So as I hope is really evident from these examples, as a center, we're very committed to researching and understanding what's happening in the world, but we're not just academics who are content to critique or just simply make recommendations about what could or should be done. We're equally committed to working with organizations and individuals who are interested in shaping the future for the better. And so we see our role as a center as working with different stakeholders closely to interpret, translate, and design change, and look forward to conversations with many of you who might be participating in these. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Heather. Again, a fantastic introduction into the work of the center that is just beginning its journey, but again, an insight into both how pervasive and far-reaching these new technologies and systems and tools are, and why we need to actually invest in investigating their social implications, both in domestic and global contexts. Which are increasingly blurred anyhow. So that idea of learning, generating insights, and then having this very much practical and applied research center that will help shape practice, including humanitarian practice, for the better, and making it more perhaps adept to navigate both the opportunities and the risks in the digital age is very exciting. And speaking of navigating the opportunities and risks and looking at a very fantastic locally led but regionally and globally relevant example, I'm going to turn to you, Katie, and ask you to give us a bit of information about what is Trust Alliance, what its intents are, and how are you guys ensuring you put humanity-first approaches to technology into practice?
Great, thanks, Ivana. And just very briefly to say how exciting it is that technology is enabling a global Centre for Humanitarian Leadership conference. I realise people will be tuning in from different time zones, but I really hope some Pacific colleagues are tuning in because, as you know, you're very dear to my heart. So also manem, if you are. And also that, there was a dedicated Trust Alliance session just before this one. And so I'm going to try not to repeat what was said in that and tell a bit more of the story and talk less about the tech. Yeah, sorry if there's some overlap. So first of all, who and what are we? As Ivana said at the beginning, we're an alliance of humanitarian research and technology organisations with a mission to lead the emergence of an ethical and equitable digital identity ecosystem to better safeguard communities, mobilise our staff and volunteers. We're member-led and bring together different disciplines and expertise, but all with a shared commitment to putting humanity first. More of that later. First of all, I want to tell you the story of how we came about. So The Trust Alliance, like all good innovation collaborations, started with a real problem. In 2018, two things happened at the Australian Red Cross. Firstly, a piece of research highlighted that humanitarian staff and volunteers were moving between different organisations and having to repeat onboarding processes every time. It was expensive, inefficient, slow, and frustrating for everyone, a barrier to a fluid marketplace. And secondly, the potential for data breaches became a critical issue. So really the Trust Alliance grew around the question, how do we make it easier and safer for humanitarian staff and volunteers to move between organisations, particularly during rapid deployment when, as we all know, our systems are tested, compromises and mistakes can be made, and at worst, that puts those most at risk at harm. So the idea began that an ecosystem could be built amongst organisations who trusted each other to enable humanitarian staff and volunteers to safely share their training credentials across different organisations. At the same time, we were seeing more use cases emerging for blockchain technology, particularly around supply chains and cash-based programming, that's been mentioned already. In essence, the humanity first opportunity with this technology for the Trust Alliance is really that it gives individuals ownership over their own credentials rather than it being a central organisation. So they can take them with them. They have the autonomy to choose who to share with and what to share. They're issued real time, so they're tamper-proof, and personal information is more secure, obviously minimising the potential for data breaches and malicious attacks or data being on-sold by a company. So seeing the potential in this technology, Australian Red Cross developed a digital credentialing tool called Traverse that enables people to prove their skills and experience to anyone using their mobile phone or device. But that's actually only one piece of the picture, and because for individuals to own their credentials is one thing, and to have agency, but it still needs agreement within and between organisations if those credentials are going to be portable across different organisations, such as the humanitarian sector. For example, if a delegate shares a child safeguarding training credential, they've been issued by the Red Cross, and this is accepted by Oxfam because Oxfam knows that the Red Cross training is of the same quality as Oxfam's. That's a very simple example. Tools like Traverse enable this to happen, but it's the human and organisational issue that's important. It needs an ecosystem, and that's where the Trust Alliance comes in. Fast forward to today. So Trust Alliance ecosystem, we've got around 20 organisations and growing. But I do want to emphasise it's still very early days for us. We're carefully and purposefully thinking about how we might transition to scale, exploring potential in different contexts, what happens next, testing different collaboration models. We've tested the technology and used pilots to scope areas of work, and now we're really focusing in on how we grow the ecosystem around these, uncovering use cases where there is benefit in reaching agreement about what credentials will be accepted across organisations. We're starting with child safeguarding training, and as a longer piece, we're also exploring how we can use this technology to prevent predators being recycled through the sector, because as we all know, if we're talking humanity first, then we need to be doing absolutely everything we can to tackle this. How our commitment to humanity first is put into practice is wide into the decisions we make about human and technical governance, our research, how we collaborate with each other, the robust discussions we have. And I'm looking at the time, so I'm just skipping forward. Working with different sectors means navigating, of course, different clocks, speeds, and having challenging conversations. Technology vendors, you know, it's about speed and agility. A large humanitarian organisation can take 12 months to review an MOU, so it's not easy. But this means that we do get to harness different capabilities and perspectives that we don't have alone, and this helps us simultaneously look and work horizontally, vertically, and out. means that we're working with practitioners to help solve a real problem for them, driven by them, learning from them. And at the same time, our foresight and research collaborators, including some of the people here, help us understand the far future landscape and opportunity for the sector, including potential unintended consequences. And we need all of this to educate the sector about the potential of the opportunity, as well as advocate more broadly at every level, from practitioner to CEO and board, because this is a new conversation. Crossing the chasm between potential and actual value hinges on creating engagement and buy-in from others. I'm going to finish in 1 minute, Ivana. So finally, my take home is we keep reminding ourselves that responsible technology is just a means to enable better humanitarian outcomes. We try not to become seduced by it or led by it. The technology might give people control of their own identity data, but as we know, choice is not made in a power vacuum. At the same time, as Libby said earlier, it's about not wasting this opportunity. As a minimum, what we're learning is that what these technologies do offer is a way to simplify some of our systems and processes to free up time and resources to focus on the more complex issues, and this is really important. And that by making compliance and training systems easier, it may remove barriers to participation for local humanitarian organisations. Beyond efficiencies, we're only just learning about the social value and risks of this technology, but the digital credentialing economy is here and here to stay. And we're seeing more and more private sector engagement. So yes, we are at a crossroads. We do have an opportunity to be at the forefront of this before it's imposed upon us, to put people at the centre and in control of their own identities, to enable better humanitarian outcomes that take us well beyond just doing no harm. That's it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Katie. Again, amazing effort in putting so many interesting points and summarizing them into under 10 minutes. So well done. And a great story to tell, I think, elevating, what is humanity first? It's about being clear about the problems that you're solving, not creating solutions in search of a problem. It's about the need to collaborate and investigate, and perhaps that slow and steady of, how our organizations operate is not necessarily a bad thing in this particular context, because it allows us to really engage with the issues and unpack them and interrogate them, but also being aware that we do need to build our skill sets and capacities in technology and engaging across sectoral divides, perhaps, and bringing that knowledge in-house, so building from the ground up. And there's just so much more to be said about this opportunity, but the time is nigh. It's almost 3 minutes till the end of our session, so not much to go. And as I quickly, some of the key insights that you've heard about tonight, these ideas of humanity first, ensuring that benefits of technologies are widely shared, and that we need to earn the trust of affected communities and put them and the civil society at the center of this work, creating these ideas of new ways of working or new business as usual. You have heard a couple of times the mention of an agenda for change across research, policy and practice towards responsible, inclusive and ethical uses of data and technology, and how we need to work as translators across sectors and disciplines and from communities to decision makers to make these humanity-focused technology or socially beneficial technologies a reality. Now, I'd really love to share this quote from Robin Mays. Libby Young has already mentioned her. She shared this insight around communities as headquarters of their own lived experience and who should be in charge of decision-making around technologies that affect them. And she said that social agency is the core of successful, resilient communities. Our current approaches to developing technologies haven't created the methods for this yet. And I really hope that initiatives such as the Center of Excellence, Humanitech, and the Trust Alliance are part of this conversation and part of an endeavor to create the methods and shared languages around this. And final point, just to thank you all very much for joining us tonight. I would also like to thank our fantastic panel for being here and sharing their insights. Please do reach out, check out our session page for those links tomorrow. We will continue the conversation with you, and enjoy the rest of this fantastic conference. Thanks and good night.